The lights in the Veterans Center were always too dim. Commander HFY Vorthak preferred it that way. The darkness helped hide the scars that covered half his face, and the 4 cybernetic limbs that had replaced the ones he lost in the war. He sat in his usual chair, staring out the window at the stars beyond Kepler 7 station. 50 years had passed since the human-Zephyrian War ended, but the memories still felt fresh. The nightmares still came every night. Commander Vorthak, a young voice spoke behind him. HFY turned slowly. A female Zephyrian stood in the doorway. She was young, maybe 30 cycles old. Her violet skin was unmarked by battle, and her 4 arms moved with the confidence of someone who had never known real fear. "I am Kira Lin from Zephyrian News Network," she said. "I sent you several messages about an interview." "I got them," HFY replied. His voice was rough from years of damage. "I also ignored them." Kira Lin stepped closer. She carried a small recording device and a datapad. "Commander, you fought in the most important battles of the war. The people need to hear your story." "The people know the story," HFY said. "We won, humans lost, end of story, but the details matter." Kira Lin pressed. "How did we defeat them? What was it like to fight such a primitive species? Our children learn about the war in school, but they need to hear from someone who was there." HFY looked at her for a long moment. She reminded him of himself 50 years ago. Young, eager, certain about how the universe worked. The war had taught him that certainty was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Sit down," he said finally. Kira Lin quickly set up her recording equipment. Her movements were excited, like a child about to hear her favorite story. "Where should we start?" "The beginning," HFY said. "But understand something first. What I'm going to tell you is not the story you want to hear. It is not the story they teach in schools. It is the truth." "I want the truth," Kira Lin said confidently. HFY almost smiled. "We will see." He closed his eyes and let his mind drift back 50 years. The pain in his cybernetic limbs seemed to grow stronger as the memories returned. "I was a lieutenant then," he began, 25 cycles old and sure I knew everything about war. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 47 star systems. We had never lost a battle. Our technology was superior to every species we encountered. "Until you met the humans," Kira Lin said. "No," HFY corrected. "We met the humans early in the war. They were exactly what we expected. Primitive bipeds with crude weapons and no real technology. They lived on just one planet and a few small colonies. Their fastest ships took months to travel between star systems. Our ships could make the same journey in days. So what made them dangerous?" HFY was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a transport ship was docking at the station. Inside were probably humans and Zephyrians working together, traveling together, living together. 50 years ago, such a sight would have been impossible. "At first, nothing made them dangerous," he said. "We destroyed their orbital defenses easily. We landed on their colony worlds and took them in hours. The humans fought, but they always lost. Their weapons could barely scratch our armor. Their tactics were simple and predictable. But something changed?" "Something changed," HFY agreed. "My first real battle with humans was on Proxima Ridge. It was a mining planet with maybe 10,000 human colonists. My squad was sent to secure the main settlement." He paused, remembering the red dust of that world and the way it had tasted in his mouth during the battle. "We expected easy victory," he continued. 12 elite Zephyrian soldiers against maybe 50 human defenders. We had energy shields, plasma weapons, enhanced strength and speed. The humans had projectile weapons that fired small pieces of metal. "Kinetic weapons," Kira Lin said. "Very primitive." "Yes, very primitive." HFY touched one of his cybernetic arms. "But effective enough." "What happened in the battle?" "For the first hour, everything went as planned. We advanced, they retreated. We killed many of them, they killed none of us. We cornered the last group in an old mining facility." HFY stood up and walked to the window. The stars looked the same as they had 50 years ago, but everything else had changed. "There were maybe 15 humans left," he said. "They were wounded, running out of ammunition, trapped in a collapsed tunnel. Any rational species would have surrendered. Any smart commander would have saved his people for future battles. But they did not surrender. They did not surrender." HFY turned back to face her. Instead, they did something that made no tactical sense. Something that went against every principle of warfare I had ever learned. Kira Lin leaned forward. "What did they do?" "They sacrificed themselves." The words came out quietly, but they seemed to echo in the small room. "Not not to kill us, not to achieve some military objective. They detonated their own ammunition supplies to collapse more of the tunnel. Why would they do that? To buy time, HFY said. There was an evacuation convoy 3 kilometers away. Civilians, human families with children. The explosion delayed us for maybe 20 minutes. Just long enough for those families to escape. He sat back down, suddenly feeling very tired. 15 soldiers died to save maybe 100 civilians they would never see again, he continued. People who would never know their names or what they had done. There was no glory in it. No statues would be built for them. They just died in a dark tunnel so strangers could live. Kirillin was quiet for a moment. That seemed wasteful. That is what I thought too, HFY said. But as I stood in that tunnel looking at their bodies, I realized something was wrong with my understanding. What do you mean? A human medic was among the dead, a female. She had been wounded early in the fight, but kept treating the other humans until the end. When we found her body, she was lying next to one of our soldiers who had been captured earlier. HFY paused, remembering the scene clearly even after 50 years. She had used her last medical supplies on him, he said, a Zephyrian soldier who had been trying to kill her an hour before. She could have let him die and saved the supplies for her own people. Instead, she treated his wounds. Why would she do that? I asked our prisoner that same question when he recovered. He told me her last words to him. She spoke in broken Zephyrian, but he understood her. She said, "Everyone deserves to go home." The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the station's life support systems. That was when I first realized, HFY said, that these humans might not be as primitive as we thought. Not in the ways that really mattered. Kirillin looked confused. But Commander, we won the war. Surely their sentiment was just weakness? HFY looked at her with something like pity. Young one, that battle at Proxima Ridge was just the beginning. What I saw in the years that followed, what I learned about humans and about myself. He trailed off, staring out at the stars again. What did you learn? Kirillin asked softly. That winning and losing are not always what they seem, HFY said. That sometimes the defeated can change the victors more than the victors change the defeated. And that what I saw that day was just the smallest taste of what humans were truly capable of. He turned back to her, and Kirillin saw something in his scarred face that made her recording equipment suddenly feel very small and inadequate. What I saw in battle with humans, he said quietly, will shock you too. But not for the reasons you think. The memory came back like a physical blow. HFY closed his eyes and was 25 again, standing on the red soil of Proxima Ridge with the taste of victory turning to ash in his mouth. Tell me about the battle, Kirillin said, her recording device humming softly. HFY opened his eyes but did not see the veteran center around him. Instead, he saw the mining colony as it had been 50 years ago. Low buildings scattered across red hills. Humans working the mineral extractors, unaware that death was coming from the sky. We dropped from orbit at dawn, he said. 12 soldiers in full combat armor. Our intel said 50 human defenders, maybe fewer. They had been on Proxima Ridge for only 3 years. A new colony barely established. The transport ships had been sleek and silent. Zephyrian technology at its finest. They landed outside the main settlement like metal predators, disgorging soldiers who moved with the confidence of a superior species. I was excited, HFY admitted. This was my first command mission. I wanted to prove myself to my superiors. I wanted to show them that Lieutenant Vorthak could handle anything. The humans must have been terrified, Kirillin said. Some were, but not all. HFY remembered the first human he had seen clearly, a male in work clothes standing near a mining platform. The human had looked at the Zephyrian dropships without running. Instead, he had picked up a communication device and spoken calmly into it, warning others, buying time for them to prepare. Their weapons were laughable, HFY continued. Kinetic rifles that fired small metal projectiles. Some had explosive devices that worked by chemical reaction instead of energy plasma. Primitive tools for a primitive species. How long did the battle last? The first phase lasted 40 minutes. We advanced through the settlement systematically. Our energy shields deflected their bullets easily. Our plasma weapons cut through their cover like it was made of paper. They fell back, taking their wounded with them. HFY remembered feeling disappointed. This was supposed to be a real battle, not target practice. The humans seemed weak, disorganized. They retreated constantly, never standing their ground for long. But they did not break, he said, surprising himself with the observation. I expected them to panic, to run in different directions. Instead, they retreated in good order. They covered each other, helped their wounded, maintained communication. Military discipline, Kirillin noted. More than that, these were not all soldiers. Many were civilians, miners, engineers, farmers, but they fought like they had trained together for years. The memory shifted, becoming more vivid. Zexhai could smell the smoke from burning buildings and feel the weight of his plasma rifle in his hands. We cornered the last group in Mining Complex 7, he said, an old tunnel system that went deep into the ridge. Maybe 15 humans were left alive. We had them trapped with no way out. So you moved in to finish them? We tried. Zexhai's cybernetic hand clenched involuntarily. But the tunnels were narrow. We could only send 2 soldiers at a time. The humans had prepared defensive positions. For the first time in the battle, the Zephyrians had faced real resistance. The humans used the tunnel walls as cover, firing from prepared positions. They had placed explosive devices at key points, collapsing sections to slow the advance. It should have been easy, Zexhai said. We still had superior weapons and armor, but in those tight spaces with limited room to maneuver, they fought well, they fought desperately. But that was not what shocked me. Zexhai paused, remembering the moment when everything changed. We captured one of their soldiers during the tunnel fighting. A young male with a wounded leg. Standard protocol was to interrogate prisoners immediately. What did he tell you? Nothing useful. But while we were questioning him, we intercepted human communications from deeper in the tunnel. They were not talking about tactics or weapons. They were talking about the evacuation convoy. Zexhai remembered listening to the human voices over their crude radio system. The words had been in their primitive language, but his translation device had made the meaning clear. There were civilian transports leaving the far side of the ridge, he said. Families with children mostly. The defenders knew about them. They were buying time for those transports to reach minimum safe distance. Protecting non-combatants, Kirillin said. That makes sense, does it? Zexhai looked at her sharply. These humans knew they were going to die. They knew we would win. But instead of surrendering to save their own lives, they chose to sacrifice themselves for people who were already safe. Safe? The transports were 3 kilometers away and moving fast. We could not have caught them even if we had known about them immediately. The tactical situation was clear. Those civilians would escape whether the defenders held the tunnel or not. Kirillin frowned. Then why did they keep fighting? That was exactly what I asked our prisoner. He looked at me like I had asked why water was wet. He said, we're buying time. Every minute we hold you here is another minute they have to get further away. The words had made no sense to young Lieutenant Vorthak. In Zephyrian military doctrine, soldiers preserved their lives for future battles. Unnecessary sacrifice was considered a waste of resources. I explained to him that his sacrifice was meaningless, Zexhai said, that those transports were already beyond our reach. You know what he said? What? He said maybe, but what if you're wrong? What if there's a delay, or mechanical trouble, or children who are too scared to move fast? What if that extra 10 minutes is the difference between life and death for a 5-year-old girl? Zexhai stood up and walked to the window again. The stars outside seemed dimmer than before. I told him the probability was minimal, less than 5% chance that their sacrifice would matter. He looked at me with these strange human eyes and said, then we die for a 5% chance. That's still a chance. Irrational, Kirillin observed. That is what I thought. But then the explosion came. The memory of that moment was burned into Zexhai's mind. The tunnel had shaken violently and rock dust had filled the air. Emergency lights had flickered and died. The remaining humans had detonated their ammunition supply, he said. All of it. The explosion brought down half the tunnel system. Did it kill them? All of them. And 3 of my soldiers. Zexhai touched his scarred face. I was close enough to the blast to get this reminder. But you survived. I survived. And in the wreckage, I found something that changed how I thought about these humans forever. Zexhai remembered crawling through the collapsed tunnel, looking for survivors. The air had been thick with dust and smoke. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the broken walls. I found the human medic first, he said. A female, badly wounded early in the fight. She was lying next to our captured soldier. The prisoner? Yes, she had dragged herself to him after the explosion. Used her last medical supplies to treat his wounds. Her own people were dead or dying around her. but she spent her final moments keeping a Zephyrian soldier alive. The image was still clear in Zexhi's memory. The human female had been small even by human standards. Her uniform was torn and bloody, but her hands had been steady as she worked on the Zephyrian's injuries. I asked her why. Zexhi said, "Why save an enemy when her own people needed help?" What did she say? She was dying, could barely speak. But she looked at me and said in broken Zephyrian, "Everyone deserves to go home." Then she closed her eyes and was gone. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of Kira Lynn's recording device. I stood in that tunnel for a long time, Zexhi continued, looking at her body and thinking about what she had said. Everyone deserves to go home. Not just humans. Not just allies, everyone. A naive sentiment, Kira Lynn said. That is what I told myself. But as I carried our wounded soldier back to the surface, I could not stop thinking about it. This human had died believing that even her enemies were worth saving. That even in war some things mattered more than victory. Zexhi returned to his chair, suddenly feeling very old. That was my first real lesson about humans, he said. Not that they were brave or clever or determined. I had seen brave enemies before, but I had never seen an enemy who would die to save my life. It changed how you fought them. It changed how I thought about them. And as the war continued, I learned that what I had seen on Proxima Ridge was not unusual for humans. It was normal. It was who they were. Kira Lynn leaned forward. What do you mean? Zexhi looked at her with tired eyes. I mean that Proxima Ridge was just the beginning. What I saw there was nothing compared to what came later. The real shock was not what humans were willing to do for their own people. Then what? The real shock was what they were willing to do for us. 2 years had passed since Proxima Ridge. Commander Zexhi now wore the rank insignia of a full commander, promoted after his reports about human fighting capabilities had proven accurate. The war was going well for the Zephyrian Empire, but each victory seemed to cost more than the last. Europa Station was supposed to be the end, Zexhi told Kira Lynn. High Command believed that if we took their main supply hub, the human resistance would collapse. Kira Lynn adjusted her recording device. How important was this station? Everything flowed through Europa Station. Weapons, food, medical supplies, communications equipment. It sat at the center of 7 major shipping routes. Control Europa Station, and you control human logistics for half their territory. Zexhi remembered the briefing clearly. Admiral Kethavar had stood before a holographic display, showing the massive space station orbiting Jupiter's moon. The structure was huge, almost a small city floating in space. Intelligence reported 10,000 human defenders. Zexhi continued. We brought 50,000 troops and 200 warships. The math was simple. 5-to-1 odds with superior technology. The siege should have lasted days, maybe weeks at most. But it didn't. It lasted 14 months. The words came out heavy with memory. 14 months of the most brutal fighting I had ever experienced. Not because the humans were stronger than us, but because they were something we had never encountered before. What do you mean? Zexhi stood and began pacing. The veteran's center suddenly felt too small, too confining. He needed space to tell this story properly. We began with standard siege tactics, he said. Cut off their supply lines, bombard their defenses. Wait for them to surrender when they ran out of food and ammunition. Standard procedure. Yes. But humans do not follow standard procedures. Zexhi stopped pacing and looked directly at Kira Lynn. After 3 weeks, our sensors showed they were running low on power. Their defensive batteries were firing less frequently. We prepared for their surrender. But they did not surrender. They improvised. Human engineers began converting civilian equipment into weapons. Cargo lifters became missile launchers. Mining equipment became artillery. Waste recycling systems became explosive devices. The memory was vivid, watching human ingenuity turn peaceful tools into instruments of war. Zexhi had been both impressed and disturbed by their creativity. That was when I first understood, he said. Humans do not just adapt to changing conditions. They transform conditions to suit their needs. They take what exists and make it into what they require. Resourceful, Kira Lynn noted. Beyond resourceful. Adaptive in ways we had never seen. But that was not the shocking part. Zexhi resumed pacing. The shocking part was how they shared resources under siege. Shared resources? Standard siege protocol assumes that as supplies dwindle, discipline breaks down. Soldiers begin hoarding food and ammunition. Officers take the best shelter and equipment. Unity fractures under pressure. Zexhai remembered watching the humans through surveillance devices, expecting to see the familiar signs of social collapse. Instead, he had witnessed something that challenged his understanding of intelligent behavior. They did the opposite, he said. As conditions worsened, they became more united. When food ran low, the humans established rationing systems that ensured everyone received equal shares. Officers ate the same rations as the lowest-ranking soldiers. Inefficient, Kirillin observed. Strong fighters should receive more resources to maintain combat effectiveness. That is what we thought. But human morale never broke. Even after months of siege, even when they were eating recycled protein paste and drinking recycled water, they continued fighting with the same intensity. The siege had dragged on month after month. Zephyrian forces had expected quick victory. But the humans had turned Europa Station into a fortress that seemed to grow stronger under pressure. 6 months into the siege, we captured a section of the station's outer ring. Zexhai continued. We found something that made no sense according to our intelligence. What did you find? Zephyrian prisoners. 43 of our soldiers who had been captured during failed boarding actions. According to our estimates, the humans should have been on starvation rations by that point. Zexhai paused, remembering the moment when everything he thought he knew about warfare had changed again. Our prisoners were healthy, he said, well-fed, medically treated, housed in heated compartments with proper life support. They were receiving the same rations as human defenders. They were sharing food with enemy prisoners, while their own children were hungry, yes. While their own soldiers were eating minimal rations, they maintained full nutrition for Zephyrian prisoners. It made no tactical sense. Kirillin looked confused. Why would they do that? I asked the same question when we finally exchanged prisoners. One of our captured officers, Colonel Detheran, told me something I will never forget. Zexhai sat back down, his cybernetic limbs whirring softly as they adjusted to his position. Detheran said the humans had asked him about Zephyrian dietary needs. They wanted to make sure the food they were sharing would not make him sick. When he asked why they cared, a human medic told him, because you have a family back home who wants to see you again. Sentiment. More than sentiment. Philosophy. These humans believed that treating prisoners well was more important than gaining tactical advantage. They weakened themselves to strengthen their enemies. The siege had continued for 8 more months after that exchange. Zephyrian forces had gradually worn down human defenses, but the cost had been enormous. For every section of the station they captured, they paid in blood and time. Month 12 was when we finally broke their main defensive line. Zexhai said, we thought victory was close. But the humans had one more surprise. What kind of surprise? They had been building something in the station's central core. Not weapons or defenses, but living quarters, hydroponic gardens, schools, medical facilities. Zexhai remembered walking through those corridors after the final battle. The contrast had been stark. Outer sections damaged by months of fighting, inner sections that looked like a peaceful colony. They had been planning for after the war, he said. Even while fighting for their lives, they had been building places where families could live together. Human and Zephyrian families. Together, I found architectural plans in their computer systems. Residential areas designed for mixed populations. Recreation areas built to accommodate both human and Zephyrian physiological needs. They were planning a future where former enemies would be neighbors. The revelation had been more shocking than any weapon or tactic. While Zephyrian forces had been focused on conquest, humans had been planning coexistence. In the final assault, we found a human child in one of those residential areas. Zexhai continued. A little girl, maybe 8 years old. She was drawing pictures while the battle raged outside. What kind of pictures? Human and Zephyrian children playing together. Stick figures with labels like Tommy and Kethvi and Sarah and Dexon. At the bottom of the paper she had written, after the fighting stops in both human and Zephyrian languages. Kirillin was quiet for a moment. A child's fantasy, was it? I kept that drawing. I still have it. Zexhai reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Look at it and tell me it is fantasy. He handed the paper to Kirillin. She unfolded it carefully, studying the simple drawing. Stick figures with different numbers of arms played games together under a smiling sun. The proportions were wrong and the perspective was childish, but the intent was clear. She drew this while under siege? Kirillin asked. While explosions shook the walls and people died in the corridors outside, yes, this 8-year-old human girl was imagining a future where the fighting would end and everyone would be friends. What happened to her? She survived. Her parents had been killed early in the siege, but the human defenders had taken care of her. Fed her, taught her, protected her. They had also been teaching her Zephyrian language and customs. HFY pointed to the bottom of the drawing. See how she wrote both languages? They were preparing her to live in the world she had drawn. A world where humans and Zephyrians were not enemies. Naive optimism. I thought so too. But as I stood in that station looking at everything the humans had built while under siege, I began to wonder. What if it was not naive? What if it was the most sophisticated strategy of all? What do you mean? They were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting to create something new. Something that had never existed before. A future where former enemies could become families. HFY took the drawing back and folded it carefully. That little girl changed how I thought about the war, he said. Not through violence or tactics, but through hope. She showed me that humans were not just trying to defeat us. They were trying to save us from ourselves, from endless war, from the idea that victory requires the destruction of your enemy. Did it work? HFY looked out the window at the mixed crews working on the station docks. Humans and Zephyrians loading cargo together, sharing meals, laughing at each other's jokes. What do you think? He asked. Carolyn followed his gaze and saw what he was looking at. Her expression changed as understanding began to dawn. The station fell after 14 months, HFY said. The final year of the war had been brutal. Human resistance had grown stronger instead of weaker, despite losing system after system. HFY, now a senior commander in the Zephyrian fleet, found himself questioning orders that once seemed perfectly logical. High Command decided to end the war with one decisive strike, he told Kira Lin. A full assault on Earth itself. Every ship, every soldier, overwhelming force that would crush human resistance forever. How many ships did you bring? 3,000 warships. 500,000 soldiers. The largest fleet in Zephyrian history. HFY's cybernetic fingers drummed against his chair. Earth had maybe 300 ships and no orbital defenses left. The math was simple, 10-to-1 odds. More than that when you counted weapons and technology. Human ships were slower, weaker, older. Many were converted civilian vessels with improvised weapons. It should have been a massacre. HFY remembered standing on the bridge of the flagship, watching Earth grow larger on the view screen. The blue and white planet looked peaceful, beautiful even. Hard to believe it was the home of such stubborn enemies. Admiral Kethvar gave the standard speech before battle. He continued, "Total victory, swift end to the war, glory for the Empire." The crews cheered. Everyone believed we would be home within days. But you had doubts? I had learned not to underestimate humans. 3 years of fighting them had taught me that they always had surprises, but even I did not expect what happened next. The human fleet had appeared suddenly, emerging from behind Earth's moon in perfect formation. 300 ships against 3,000, but they moved with precision that spoke of careful planning. They came straight at us, HFY said. No fancy maneuvers, no attempt to use terrain advantages. Just a direct charge into the heart of our fleet. Suicide? That is what I thought. Brave but futile, we opened fire at maximum range, expecting to destroy them before they could cause significant damage. The memory was painful even 50 years later. HFY could still see the first human ships dying under Zephyrian fire, their hulls torn apart by plasma cannons and energy missiles. For the first hour, everything went as predicted. We destroyed 50 human ships and lost only 3 of our own. But then something changed. What changed? The humans stopped trying to win a conventional battle. Instead, they began doing something I had never seen before in space combat. HFY stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful station beyond. Trading ships moved slowly between docking arms, their cargo holds full of goods from a dozen different worlds. They began ramming our ships, he said quietly. Deliberately, human pilots would line up their vessels with critical targets and accelerate to maximum speed. Desperate measures. I thought so too at first, but as I watched it happen again and again, I realized this was not desperation. It was strategy. Each ramming attack was precisely calculated. Calculated how? Human ships targeted our command vessels, our carriers, our supply ships. They ignored easier targets in favor of maximum strategic impact. And the pilots? HFY paused, remembering faces he had seen on intercepted communications. The pilots volunteered for these missions. Volunteered to die? Volunteered to save their world. I intercepted communications between human ships. Pilots were arguing over who got to make ramming runs, fighting over the privilege of dying for their cause. The memory was still sharp after all these years. Zexai had listened to human voices over the radio, voices full of determination and strange joy as they prepared to die. One transmission I will never forget, he said. A female pilot saying goodbye to her daughter. She told the child, "Mommy is going to make sure you have a tomorrow to grow up in." Then she accelerated her ship into our flagship's engine core. Did she succeed? She disabled our main battleship and killed 3,000 Zephyrian soldiers, including Admiral Cathvar. Zexai touched his scarred face. I was on the bridge when she hit. That is where I got most of these injuries. But the humans were still outnumbered. Yes, we kept fighting. Human ships kept dying, but something was happening to our fleet that nobody had anticipated. Zexai returned to his chair, his movements slower than before. The memories were taking their toll. Our soldiers began hesitating, he said. When human ships moved to ram us, some of our gunners held their fire a fraction of a second too long. Not enough to change tactical outcomes, but enough to notice. Why would they hesitate? Because they had begun to understand what they were seeing. Human pilots were not dying because they were cornered or desperate. They were choosing to die to protect people they loved. The change had been subtle at first. Zephyrian crews fighting with less enthusiasm, taking fewer risks, showing mercy when military doctrine called for ruthlessness. The turning point came when my own ship was rammed, Zexai continued. A human destroyer, barely a quarter of our size. The pilot could have targeted our weapons or engines. Instead, he aimed for our life support systems. To kill the crew? No. To disable the ship without destroying it. Zexai's voice became quiet. His ship hit us and exploded, but the blast was directed outward. Minimum damage to our hull, maximum damage to his own vessel. That makes no sense. It made perfect sense if his goal was to stop us from fighting without killing us, and that is exactly what happened. My ship was crippled but intact. Most of my crew survived. What happened next had changed everything Zexai thought he knew about war, about enemies, about the nature of conflict itself. As we drifted helpless, a human rescue ship approached, he said, not to finish us off, but to offer aid. A trick? No trick. The human captain contacted us directly, said his name was Miller, and asked if we needed medical assistance. His ship had medical supplies and doctors. Kira Lynn looked confused. Enemy doctors treating enemy wounded? Enemy doctors risking their lives to save enemy wounded. Captain Miller's ship was defenseless while helping us. One shot from any Zephyrian vessel would have destroyed them. But they came anyway. Did you accept their help? I should have refused. Military protocol was clear. No aid from enemy forces. But I had 30 wounded soldiers who would die without treatment, and this human was offering to save them. Zexai remembered that moment clearly. Captain Miller had been an older human with gray hair and kind eyes. He had spoken perfect Zephyrian and shown genuine concern for wounded enemies. Miller came aboard our ship personally, Zexai said, brought medical supplies and 3 human doctors. They worked for 6 hours treating Zephyrian wounded. While the battle continued around you, while the battle continued around us, human and Zephyrian ships fighting and dying within visual range, and these doctors worked to save lives without regard for species or allegiance. What did you talk about with Captain Miller? I asked him why. Why risk his ship and crew to help enemies? He said something that I still think about every day. Zexai paused, looking out at the stars beyond the station. Somewhere out there, humans and Zephyrians were working together on colonies that neither species could have built alone. Miller said, "Commander, this war will end someday. When it does, we all have to live in the same galaxy. I would rather live with former enemies who remember kindness than former enemies who remember only cruelty." Philosophy during warfare. Philosophy that changed warfare. Because Miller was not alone. Across the battlefield, human ships were offering aid to disabled Zephyrian vessels, and Zephyrian crews were beginning to respond. How do you mean? Some of our captains began ordering rescue operations for human survivors. Not for intelligence purposes, but because they could not watch enemy soldiers die when they had the power to help. The battle had continued for 12 more hours, but the character of the fighting had changed. Acts of mercy became more common. Rescue operations multiplied. Surrender was accepted more readily by both sides. By the end, Zexai said, we had technically won the battle. Earth's defenses were broken and their fleet was destroyed. But something else had been broken too. What? The certainty that humans were our enemies. Half my fleet was having doubts about the war. Officers were asking questions about our goals and methods. Soldiers were sharing medical supplies with human prisoners. What happened next? High Command ordered us to proceed with the planetary invasion. Full occupation of Earth, total subjugation of human population, standard protocol for conquered species. Zexai looked directly at Kira Lin, his scarred face serious. I refused the order. You mutinied? I told High Command that my fleet was no longer capable of fighting humans effectively. That prolonged contact with human philosophy had compromised our military efficiency. Was that true? Completely true. My soldiers had seen humans die to save strangers. They had been rescued by human medical teams. They had watched enemies treat prisoners with kindness. How could I ask them to turn around and massacre a planet full of such people? So the invasion was called off? The invasion was called off. But more importantly, other fleet commanders began reporting similar problems. Across the entire war zone, Zephyrian forces were becoming reluctant to fight. Because of human influence? Because humans had shown us a different way to think about conflict. They had demonstrated that enemies could become allies, that victory did not require the destruction of the defeated. Kira Lin sat in stunned silence. Her recording device continued humming, but she seemed to have forgotten it existed. The story she had expected to hear was gone, replaced by something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the war. You are saying humans won? She finally asked. I am saying humans achieved something more important than victory, Zexai replied. They achieved transformation, not just of themselves, but of us. But the history books say we conquered them. We control their territory now. Zexai smiled sadly. Do we? Look around this station, Kira Lin. Look out that window. Tell me who controls what. She followed his gaze to the observation deck. Human and Zephyrian workers moved together, loading cargo ships bound for colonies across both species' territories. Children of both races played together in the station's recreation areas. Mixed crews operated vessels flying under joint command structures. This is not conquest, Zexai said. This is partnership. This is what humans were fighting for from the beginning. When did it change? The change began during the war, but it accelerated after the fighting stopped. Within 6 months of the ceasefire, Zephyrian colonies were requesting human advisors. Within a year, joint settlements were being established. Zexai remembered those early days after the war. The confusion among Zephyrian leaders who had expected to rule over conquered subjects, not work alongside equal partners. High Command tried to maintain traditional occupation policies, he continued. But it was impossible. How do you occupy people who keep offering to help you? What do you mean? Human colonies that were supposed to be under military control kept sending aid to Zephyrian settlements. Medical supplies, food, technical expertise. They offered to share agricultural knowledge that could feed our people better. They volunteered to help build schools where Zephyrian children could learn alongside human ones. The memory was still vivid. Zexai's own assignment to oversee a supposedly conquered human colony, only to find the colonists eager to cooperate and share their resources. I was assigned to govern a human settlement on Kepler 4, he said. I arrived expecting resistance, possibly insurgency. Instead, the humans met me at the landing pad with a welcome ceremony. They welcomed their conqueror. They welcomed their new neighbor. The colony leader, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, showed me around their settlement and explained how they could help establish a Zephyrian community nearby. Zexai remembered Dr. Chen clearly, a small human with bright eyes and an enthusiasm that was infectious. She had treated him not as an occupying force, but as a partner in building something new. Dr. Chen showed me plans they had been working on, he said. Integrated settlements where humans and Zephyrians could live together, shared research facilities, joint exploration missions, cultural exchange programs. They had been planning cooperation during the war? They had been planning cooperation since before the war started. Humans had always assumed that peace would come eventually, and that former enemies would become friends. They were just waiting for us to reach the same conclusion. How long did it take? For me, about 6 months on Kepler 4. Dr. Chen was patient with my suspicions and confusion. She answered every question, addressed every concern, and gradually helped me understand that humans had never wanted to defeat us. Zexai paused, remembering the moment when his worldview had finally shifted completely. The breakthrough came when Dr. Chen asked me about my family back on Zephyr Prime. She wanted to know about Zephyrian customs, our foods, our celebrations, not for intelligence purposes, but because she was planning a cultural festival where both species could share their traditions. A festival? The first joint human-Zephyrian cultural celebration. Dr. Chen believed that people who understood each other's cultures could not remain enemies for long. Was she right? The festival was a revelation. Zephyrian soldiers who had been occupying the colony found themselves dancing to human music and teaching humans traditional Zephyrian games. By the end of the evening, I could not tell who were the conquerors and who were the conquered. The transformation had been rapid after that. Similar festivals spread to other colonies. Joint projects multiplied. Within a year, the line between occupier and occupied had blurred beyond recognition. That was when High Command realized they had a problem. Zexai continued. Their occupation forces were being absorbed into human communities instead of controlling them. What did they do? They tried to rotate personnel, bring in fresh troops who had not been exposed to human influence. But the same thing kept happening. Zephyrians who came to rule stayed to build. Because of human manipulation? Because of human example. Humans showed us what life could be like when you focused on creation instead of destruction, cooperation instead of conquest. Zexai pulled out the folded drawing again, looking at the childish stick figures playing together under a smiling sun. That little girl from Europa Station, he said. Her drawing became reality faster than anyone expected. Within 3 years of the war's end, mixed communities were common. Children grew up speaking both languages, learning both cultures. What happened to the girl? Dr. Sarah Chen adopted her. The child had no living relatives, so Dr. Chen became her guardian. Last I heard, she was studying to become a diplomat, specializing in interspecies relations. She grew up to work for peace. She grew up in peace. Peace that her drawing had helped create. And she was not alone. An entire generation of human and Zephyrian children grew up together, seeing cooperation as normal and conflict as strange. Kirillin looked confused. But if humans won through transformation, why do our history books say we conquered them? Because admitting the truth would be too shocking for many Zephyrians. Easier to maintain the fiction of military victory than explain that we were changed by our supposed enemies. So the official history is false? The official history is incomplete. Yes, we won battles. Yes, we occupied territory. But the real story is what happened after the fighting stopped. Zexai gestured toward the window again. That is the real victory. Not Zephyrian domination of humans, but human transformation of Zephyrians. We became the people they believed we could be. Do you regret it? The question hung in the air for a long moment. Zexai considered his answer carefully. I regret the war, he said finally. I regret the deaths, the suffering, the years of conflict. But I do not regret the outcome. Humans taught us that strength is not about defeating others, but about lifting others up. Even at the cost of imperial expansion? What did imperial expansion give us? More territory to defend, more subjects to control, more enemies to fight. Humans offered us something better. Partners to explore with, friends to learn from, families to grow with. Zexai stood and walked to his desk, pulling out a small photograph. He handed it to Kirillin. This was taken last year, he said. The photo showed Zexai standing with a group of humans and Zephyrians at what appeared to be a medical facility. Everyone was smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders in a gesture of friendship and solidarity. That is the joint medical station on Alpha Centauri, Zexai explained. We treat patients from 17 different species now. Humans, Zephyrians, and others who have joined our alliance. Alliance? The Galactic Cooperation Council. Humans proposed it 2 years after the war ended. A federation of species working together for mutual benefit. Kirillin studied the photograph. Who are these people? My colleagues. The human woman in the center is Dr. Maria Santos, daughter of Captain Miller, the man who saved my ship during the final battle. She chose to follow her father's example of healing instead of fighting. And the others? Friends, partners, family in the way that humans use the word. People who have chosen to work together instead of against each other. Zexai pointed to a young Zephyrian in the photo. That is my nephew Kexhan. He grew up in one of the joint colonies. He speaks both languages fluently and considers humans to be his second family. How many Zephyrians feel this way? More every year. The generation that fought in the war is aging. The generation that grew up after it sees cooperation as normal. In 50 years, the idea of Zephyrians and humans as enemies will seem as strange to them as peace seems to you now. Kira Lynn set down the photograph and looked at her recording device. What should I tell people? How do I explain this? Tell them the truth, Zexai said. Tell them that we learned something important from our war with humans. We learned that the strongest force in the galaxy is not plasma cannons or energy shields. Then what is it? Love? Compassion? The willingness to die for strangers and to live for former enemies. Humans showed us that victory is not about destroying your opponents, but about transforming them into allies. And if people do not believe it, then let them look around. Let them see what the galaxy has become. Let them decide whether this reality is better or worse than endless war. Zexai returned to his chair, suddenly looking very tired. You asked me what I saw in battle with humans that would shock me, he said. The shocking thing was not their weapons or their tactics. It was not their bravery or their determination. Then what? The shocking thing was the day I realized that in trying to destroy them, we had become more like them. We had learned to value life over victory, peace over power, love over conquest.